Warren, thanks for coming. This is the RITM Spring Lecture Series, and we're really thrilled to welcome Professor Christina Heatherton, an assistant professor of American Studies at Barnard College. I just wanted to say a couple of things kind of collectively about Professor Heatherton's work, some of which you can see up here, and three things that I think I've really taken and learned from as I've engaged her work across a number of years. The first is it's very difficult to inhabit, or we often face a contradiction in inhabiting an academy that constantly rewards individuated work and asks you to imagine collaboration as sometimes something you do kind of outside of work. But Professor Heatherton, really since her time in her PhD program, has developed a practice of demonstrating that the very best scholarly work we do is also the work that has to be the most robust foundation for collaboration. So you can see this book, the image in the middle, Freedom Now, Struggles for the Human Right to Housing in LA and Beyond, which is a volume she co-edited with organizers who were organizing around issues of housing and homelessness in LA and Skid Row, artists, scholars, and others, actually showing why scholarship is at its best if it's in those kinds of relationships. The same is true for another co-edited edited project she did, Downtown Blues, a Skid Row reader, and Policing the Planet, which came out a couple of years ago with her co-editor Jordan Camp, really contains this remarkable series of essays from a range of disciplines, some by activists, some by scholars. It's all these really rich interviews where she's actually foregrounding for us the role that kind of dialogue and exchange can play in analysis and advancing ideas. So I just want to say these are often projects that scholars wait for at some like milestone after all these other individual forms of like security have been confirmed to pursue. And Professor Heatherton has modeled how that can be done, and it can be done absolutely kind of aligned with one's scholarly attention. The second is, across a number of these, and these are The Rising Tide of Color and Feminist Rethink the Neoliberal State, are edited volumes that she's contributed essays toward. She has a forthcoming book called The Color Line and the Class Struggle, The Mexican Revolution, Internationalism, and the American Century from UC Press. There's a very careful attention to these very particular sites of material effects and structural forms of domination. Broken windows policing, the effects of unemployment and crisis in the 1930s, always wedded to the types of relationships and resistance that those structures produce. So you never complete her work feeling like processes of domination are complete, they're beyond contestation, nor do you get the sense that she's offering us some gloss on an idealized social movement that could come. She's always showing us the way in those concrete relations of domination, new possibilities are emerging. And she's giving us a different way actually to understand what's happening at these sites. And the final thing I'll say, and that I think we'll really see today, is that it's often difficult to think about aesthetics, cultural formation, and cultural production as actually tied to those material structures. Either we hive them off and try to understand them just in the registers of representation, or we think that they're actually mere kind of like expressions of the real stuff happening in the material. And Heatherton is one of the few scholars that actually shows us that those sites of cultural formation, artistic development and connections are material sites, and they should be read with seriousness because they have deep consequences. So I'm really thrilled to welcome her. I want to thank the Yale Center for the Study of Race, Indigeneity, and Transnational Migration for sponsoring the series, which includes having guest scholars come to a graduate seminar I'm teaching on relational intersectional formations of race. Please join me in welcoming Professor Christina Heatherton.
Okay, good evening, everybody. I need a little bit more than that. Good evening. Good evening. First of all, I just have to thank Dan for that very generous introduction. I'm trying to take deep breaths and not blush so hard, so just give me a second. I want to thank Dan and Steve Pitty for this very generous invitation to speak before all of you tonight. for Nicole Edwards for coordinating this visit. It's such an honor to present at the Center for the Study of Race, Indigeneity, and Transnational Migration. And I want to start off just by saying, on behalf of all junior scholars in American and ethnic studies across the country, I want to thank the faculty and students here for their consistent courage and advocacy. You know, in our work, we often draw on the intellectuals that Cedric Robinson called renegades, and it's really inspiring to see scholars live up to that reputation in their research and in their solidarity. So thank you all. Tonight I'm going to be talking about, well, let me tell you what I'm going to be talking about. Wrong PowerPoint. Here we go. Tonight I will be talking about Elizabeth Catlett, and I'm going to be discussing the connections between her politics, radical pedagogy, and, as Dan said, her cultural work. Someone recently asked about the relevance of discussing cultural work as work right now, and I think this is the right question to be asking. From the new parlance of the gig economy to the expectations that artists and writers be compensated for their work by exposure rather than by wages, I think there's a really pernicious new logic that tries incessantly to devalue us and convince us that our work is not work. So, you know, as a striking students throughout the UC system are right now compelling us to understand work is work. It should be understood, protected, and compensated as such. They're showing us that the recognition of our labor is a struggle for our humanity and for our dignity. So I speak with you tonight in solidarity with them. So let's get started. Well, how many of you have heard of Elizabeth Catlett before? Okay, great. I recently spoke to a room and I asked that question. The entire room raised their hand. I was like, so, all right. So you may know Elizabeth Catlett as the Dean of Black Women Artists, even if you don't realize that you know her. In art historian Melanie Herzog's words, she was, quote, one of the most important American artists of the past century. And I intend to agree with that statement. Internationally acclaimed for her graphic prints and signature sculptures, she created a body of work charged with rage, beauty, life, and struggle. Walking into homes of older activists, you're likely to encounter her work there. And if you read the memoirs, children of these radicals often describe growing up and running their fingers along the soft contours of her sculptures in comfort and amazement. In these ways, Elizabeth Catlett's work provides the ambient texture to radical history in the United States. Many of you are probably familiar with her widely reproduced sharecropper lithograph or her Black Power era prints. Okay, just want to make sure everything's working. Her work celebrates Black women, motherhood, collectivity, while also really dramatically representing state repression. In works like some of the ones I'll show you here, like Target, which is at the end, which was a tribute to Fred Hampton and Mark Clark, two Black Panthers who were murdered by the Chicago Police Department, or in other images such as the torture of mothers, which was made after the 1964 police beating of children in Harlem. She calls attention to racist police violence. And I want to be clear that her work was consciously and consistently made in dialogue with political struggle, both nationally and internationally. In defense, in Central America Says No, which she incorporated elements of another image called Chile too. She condemns the 1973 US-backed coup in Chile. She features a soldier blinding a protester, a poignant image that resonates with Chilean protest against neoliberalism and similar military tactics going on right now. So I don't know how many of you have seen protesters cover their eye in protest. The hands in the image honor Victor Jara, beloved singer and guitar player whose fingers were brutally broken before he was executed before a horrified stadium of people. But the hands here are joyous and they clench as fists together. I think Catlett's images evoke pain, fear, joy, and resilience. I have given the world my song, she says in another. To consider Elizabeth Catlett, then, is to behold a beloved artist whose work seems to be everywhere, but whose story is hiding in plain sight. Catlett is mostly mentioned in relation to her one-time husband, Charles White, another artist of great prominence, who I won't be talking about too much today, but if you have questions about Charles White, I'll happily answer. Catlett's name is peppered through histories of the Black Left in the 30s and 40s. If she is referenced on her own, it's mostly as a friend or fellow traveler of other self-declared radicals. Biographies and scholarly texts often downplay or minimize Catlett's politics. And this is, of course, in no small part due to an image that Catlett cultivated herself within a Cold War context. One that her biographers conceivably respected, since the viability of her professional career was perceived to be contingent on this perceived distance. We can understand that Catlett was careful in public performance to keep her political cards close, especially if we consider Darlene Clark Hines' concept of dissemblance, the appearance of openness which shields Black women, particularly in public life, from scrutiny. As Mary Helen Washington describes, this biographical performance was sometimes necessary for the survival of Black artists who were organizing on the left in the Cold War, namely Elizabeth Catlett. By the time Catlett had her first solo show at the Studio Museum in Harlem in 1971, she had been effectively shut out of the US market for decades. For most of her life, she lived and worked in Mexico, a place that Simone Brown reminds us is also home to the oldest FBI field office in the world. Catlett had long been on the FBI's watch list. After marrying her husband, Francisco Mora, and becoming a Mexican citizen, she was repeatedly denied a visa to come to the United States. This meant, of course, that she couldn't come to conferences or gallery shows. She couldn't come and speak in front of students at Yale. Even when her mother was dying, she was refused entry into the country to see her. By the time organizers campaigned to get her back into the country, she had suffered setbacks to her career and to her livelihood. So we can perhaps sympathize with some of her reticence to be totally open about her politics. But it might now be time to think anew about Elizabeth Catlett. Who was this person that the FBI watched so closely? Why did she incur this level of surveillance? Why was she deemed an enemy of the state? And what motivated her very political artwork? In the words of Catlett's longtime friend, Dr. Gwendolyn Midlow Hall, it's time to tell the truth about this exceptional artist, teacher, and organizer. At the height of the Red Scare, Catlett was classed an undesirable alien by the State Department and held in a Mexican jail for several days. She renounced her US citizenship 2 years later. Under the Immigration and Nationality Act, the US government could refuse entry to any person perceived to be a communist, and this, as her 1964 FBI file demonstrates, is what she was suspected of being. While few sustained studies have been written about her politics, we can ascertain her political history in other ways. Her name surfaces in the biographies of radicals who sought refuge in Mexico in the post-war era. When Marvin X, teacher of Huey Newton and co-founder of the Black Arts Theater, was escaping persecution from California Governor Ronald Reagan, he found shelter with Catlett in Mexico. At that time, you should be seeing something else. Let's see. Now that's what happens when you add an FBI slide to your PowerPoints. So I'll keep reading, but thanks. So at the time, Catlett was actually in the middle of doing this print on the Black Panthers when this person was very close to the Panthers, came to Mexico to seek shelter. That's okay, go ahead. Where was I? And this is what she said to Marvin X, quote, "Mexico has always given refuge to revolutionaries from around the world." So when I interviewed Elizabeth Catlett, I had the enormous privilege to interview her in Cuernavaca in 2011. She and her son recounted these wonderful stories of other radicals who had passed through their house, people like Harry Haywood, who caused, this is an adorable story, he caused a blackout in a small Mexican inn because he thought the light was too dim. He had brought his own light and he screwed it in because he had brought all these books he wanted to read, and in doing so, the whole place blacked out. Adorable. As Diana Anhalt's Gathering of Fugitives and Rebecca Schreiber's excellent Cold War Exiles in Mexico detail, Catlett assisted many many people who were fleeing to Mexico, including those who were escaping McCarthyism and the blacklist, Spanish refugees who were fleeing Franco's fascism, and Black radicals who were fleeing US state repression, among others. As she noted in a 1975 interview with Raquel Tibol, quote, "The revolutionary atmosphere in which I developed in Mexico was determinant in my development and projection." So today's presentation comes from a book I am writing. The title slightly changed. It's now called Making Internationalism, The Color Line, the Class Struggle, and the Mexican Revolution. And at some point I'm going to show you a great image of the cover, but right now you'll just have to imagine it. The book follows the internationalization of U.S. capital in the early 20th century, and it traces the concurrent history of radicals who sought clarity on the specific intersection of the color line and the class struggle. It explores how artists, writers, and other revolutionaries developed an emergent form of anti-racist internationalism. It observed how they theorized, dramatized, and challenged the racist and gendered social relations under capitalism, and consequently how they developed new articulations of struggle. It argues that their international visions provided a revolutionary alternative to the politics promoted by U.S. imperialism, and following their lead, it foregrounds the influence of the Mexican Revolution, the first major social revolution of the 20th century. So the book is organized around what I call convergent spaces. These are socio-spatial sites where multiple radical traditions are compressed together in struggle and in space. So today, with How to Make a Dress, I'll be looking at the many convergent spaces that were critical to Catlett's formation for the first 30 or so years of her life. I'll briefly, and I wish we had more time, but I'll only briefly discuss Chicago Southside Community Arts Center. I'll speak at length about her time at the George Washington Carver School in Harlem. And finally, I'll talk about the Taller de Gráphica Popular, or the TGP, an internationalist art collective in Mexico City. Recovering the life of Elizabeth Catlett through these convergent spaces helps us understand not only an overlooked biography, but I think a submerged theory of internationalism that is critical for our present moment. In her artwork and in her teaching and in her thinking, Catlett placed Black working class women, particularly Black domestic workers, at the heart of the global anti-imperialist class struggle. So by situating Catlett within the radical milieus that produced her and that she in turn helped to produce, I argue that we can more fully comprehend the radical anti-racist feminist internationalist politics of her work. And in doing so, we follow Tiffany Ruby Patterson Meyer's injunction to, quote, bring the gendered and class contours of internationalism out of the shadows. So where shall we begin? Okay, well, you saw enough pictures, right? I'm sorry. No problem. We'll make it work. So I might have to show you a lot of images with my hands. So there's a lot of places that we could start to talk about Elizabeth Catlett. We could begin in Catlett's young life, coming of age in Jim Crow, D.C., as Paula Austin describes. As a student at Dunbar High School in the early 1930s, she was arrested for protesting lynching in front of the Supreme Court with a noose around her neck. In Catlett's words, quote, I was radical since I was young. We could begin a few years later while she was a disillusioned undergraduate at Howard University. There she befriended a young communist named Pauline Myers, who was a boarder renting a room in her mother's home. Myers was a firebrand speaker at anti-war and anti-fascist demonstrations. She taught Catlett about Marxism and anti-colonialism, things Catlett said in a 1983 oral history that she, quote, never learned in school. Myers also brought friends to the house, including a number of African socialists, one of whom would kneel at Catlett's grandmother's feet and say, I'm sitting at your feet, grandmother, tell me about slavery. And this, by the way, is how Catlett learned about her own family's history of slavery, through these conversations. So through these experiences, Catlett understood her education very broadly, encompassing radical theory, her family's own history, and the world at war around her. We might also start in Durham, North Carolina, where Catlett got her first teaching job and learned pedagogy and protest at the same time. Here during the Depression, she was horrified to see working class Black students, especially girls, being cheated out of their education, mostly trained to make socks for a nearby factory. She helped organize a campaign to address pay discrepancies between Black and white teachers. But in doing so, she also learned the dynamics of what she called Black monopoly capitalism. While she was attuned to anti-Black racism, she came to understand the vicious class structure within Durham's Black community. She saw how local Black capitalists and bankers utilized bribes, withheld loans, and deployed gendered coercion to discipline the local population into acquiescing to the reigning order. I learned a lot in Durham, she said. Catlett escaped to study art at the University of Iowa. Why? Because there was no out-of-state tuition. I relate. She began working with Grant Wood, painter of the iconic American Gothic. Here, I wish I had a slide, but American Gothic, you know, the father and the daughter with the pitchfork, you can all see it in your mind's eye, right? So this is who she worked with at the University of Iowa. Wood was, of course, famous for depicting the rural Iowa landscapes that he knew best. He encouraged Catlett to depict what she knew best, so she began painting and later sculpting Black working class women, particularly Black domestic workers in uniform and Black mothers. This was perhaps a tribute to her own mother, who had taken on many jobs, including as a seamstress, a truant officer, and later a domestic worker to provide for Catlett, her siblings, and her grandmother. And it was also possibly in recognition of the local Black women in Iowa, among whom Catlett lived and socialized. Catlett won an illustrious prize for her thesis sculpture, Mother and Child. When she graduated in 1939, Catlett became one of the first people ever to earn an MFA in Fine Arts and the first Black woman at the University of Iowa to do so. We could also discuss, you see these are all hypotheticals. We could, but we're not really, but I'm giving you a taste. We could discuss Catlett's time at Prairie View College near Houston, Texas. There she first encountered, and the particular racism of that place. There, Catlett first encountered buildings with 3 separate entrances, main doors for white people, side doors marked colored, and other side doors marked Mexican. She and her friends were stopped, they were chased by speeding cars, and they were threatened by local racists. Texas segregation for Catlett was a revelation, that's her word. In each of these experiences, Catlett came to develop a sense that teaching meant making political decisions about the world one lived in and the world one chose or chose not to reproduce. As an art professor at Dillard College, a historically Black college in New Orleans, Catlett developed a reputation as a local hellraiser. That's actually what she was known as. She lived at 426 Dauphine Street in the French Quarter among very poor white families, Black and white sex workers, and a staggering white countess who she said looked like something out of a streetcar named Desire. Only her new colleague, St. Clair Drake, would visit her. And Drake came by after several Black Dillard students were arrested, falsely accused of removing the signs that demarcated the segregated sections on the local bus. I want to be clear that such signs were routinely removed by local people in New Orleans, including Catlett herself, who is fondly remembered in a lot of memoirs of people who knew her at the time. She was fondly remembered for always tearing them down. Sometimes she'd just rip them down, throw them in front of the bus driver and say, you do your own dirty work. So Catlett contacted Raymond Tillman, who was part of a Marxist group she was in at the time. Tillman, local NAACP secretary and also head of the transport union, agreed to represent the students. The case was quietly resolved since the chair of Dillard's board of directors, it appeared, was also the chief stockholder of the bus company. In 1941, Catlett famously desegregated the local Delgado Art Museum by having a bus drive 160 Black students from Dillard to the museum's front door to see a Picasso exhibit. By the way, the only other time this has happened where like the technology blew up was the first time I was ever evaluated as a professor. So it was, I'm like, I might just be cursed, but I appreciate you all being with me. I'm gonna have you imagine another picture in just a second, so get your brains ready. Okay, so Catlett desegregated this local art museum, and the way it was segregated, the museum itself wasn't formally segregated, but it was housed in the middle of this park, which was. So Catlett, understanding that she had all these Black students at Dillard who were studying art but had never been in an art museum, said, F this. She got a bus to take all 160 students to the front door of the museum, and they all went in to see this Picasso exhibit. Some of her students that day, including Samela Lewis, who later became her friend and biographer, they credited this moment to the first day of their journey to becoming artists. Not too long ago, I talked to another New Orleans artist named Willie Birch, who grew up in the city, and he described how this act reverberated for students in New Orleans for generations. So students stayed at the Delgado for hours, amazed to see the art, and studying in particular Picasso's Guernica, which was hanging there at the time. So this is the mural I want you all to try to imagine. How many of you can call up the image of Guernica in your heads? Some of you, okay, well, we might just have to deal with that, all right. Because I want to stop here with Guernica just to emphasize that Catlett's political development was forged within the struggle against racism and fascism, a struggle that was being keenly fought out through art and visual representation. Guernica depicted the fascist firebombing of a Basque town, a 3-hour ordeal where Nazi and Spanish fascist planes rained down tons of incendiary bombs. This brazen act of civilian slaughter through new war technologies was a prelude to the systematized mass murder that was to come. When the London Times reported on this attack, William Land described the air raid using a phrase that would come to dominate the lexicon of 21st century war. He called it weapons of mass destruction. A replica of Guernica still hangs in the chamber of the UN Security Council. In 2003, when Colin Powell presented the authorization for the war on terror, falsely arguing that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, the Guernica replica was covered with a blue tarp. This move, a UN spokesman said, was meant to, quote, avert a diplomatic incident. Catlett once described Guernica in a scathing response to a scholar who called revolutionary art a meaningless description. In the Mexican paper El Dia, Catlett wrote, quote, who would dare scorn the genius of Picasso, moved to shout his anger against inhumanity in the mural of Guernica? This tendency is evidence of the intentions to neutralize and control the power of art, to deny art one of its most sacred functions and artists one of their greatest responsibilities, to hold up the mirror of truth and to reveal to the eyes of humanity the repulsive presence of the exploitation of man by man. That's the cover. In the early 1940s, the struggle against racism and fascism, particularly by the Black Left, was led by women, as Catlett would learn when she moved to Chicago. Margaret Goss Burroughs, director of the Southside Community Art Center, the SSCAC, brought Catlett into the fold. So while Catlett had advanced training in art, the SSCAC offered her something new. Here politics and culture converged with rigor, joy, and intention. Here she entered a world that would profoundly shape her consciousness about art's relationship to radical internationalist politics. Like the Harlem Renaissance, Chicago's artists, intellectuals, and organizers were part of a vibrant intellectual and political culture, as authors like Brian Dolliner, Bill Mullins, Stacey Morgan, and Miriam Kaba have all described. During the so-called Chicago Renaissance, figures like dancer, now I know whatever I say, you're going to be distracted by this. Okay, but bring up any slide you want. The control won't work. Okay. Well, would you mind advancing like probably 20 slides? Okay. All right. Human PowerPoint. Well, so let's just do this really quickly. So, How to Make a Dress is the 6th chapter of this book called Making Internationalism. So you can see every chapter in the book is about the making of something. If you can just advance, we're going to have to go through probably like 20. Go ahead. Go ahead to the next one. So this is Catlett. This is an image she did while she was at Howard. This is actually a picture of her grandmother from the Tulane archives. You can go to the next one. There's a picture of Catlett as she graduated from the University of Iowa. This is self-portrait of Grant Wood. You guys all had this one nailed, right? Okay, very good. You can go to the next one. We'll talk about this one in a second, so I won't describe it too much here. I just want to point out one thing. I have special reservations. This picture of a woman on a segregated bus is often mistakenly believed to be Rosa Parks. This is 1946. I want you to think throughout this whole presentation about how ahead of her time Elizabeth Catlett was. You can go to the next one. Guernica, a really low resolution image from the internet, but hopefully it stirred your imagination of what this was. You can go to the next one. All right, so I think we're about where we need to be. This is Margaret Goss Burroughs, who I was just describing. So, Burroughs, along with other figures like dancer Kathleen Dunham, poet Gwendolyn Brooks, photographer Gordon Parks, scholars like Horace Caton, and organizers like Harry Haywood all flourished. Many were able to cultivate their talents independently or through the alliance of labor and civil rights organizations known as the National Negro Congress, as well as through Communist Party-affiliated John Reed clubs. Black artists in the scene connected local struggles against racism and poverty to the global fight against colonialism, imperialism, and fascism, particularly the Spanish Civil War. After returning from Spain, Haywood helped to organize one of the largest anti-fascist peace mobilizations, 20,000 marchers strong. And through these relationships, particularly in participants in Chicago's cultural scene, connected local struggles to a global context, developing support for the global fight against fascism and in support of the Mexican, Nicaraguan, and Haitian people's fights against US imperialism. You can go to the next one. So there's a longer story to tell about the formation of the Southside Community Art Center. These are some really glorious pictures from the Library of Congress, a lot of them by Jack Delano, Pablo's dad. We used to work with him. So this place was truly a community effort, funded through extravagant balls and fundraisers. There's a beautiful story about one of the fundraisers that I don't have time to tell. In one of them, over $20,000 in donations was collected from a cross-section of the South Side. You can go to the next one. So it's teachers, it's artists, gamblers, sex workers, as well as White Town gallery owners, with free art classes, exhibition spaces, as well as a place for artists to develop their own work. The center was tremendous for the community. At the opening, artist David Ross said, "Here was our chance to stop shining shoes all week and painting on Sunday. This gave us a means of learning as well as a means of earning our living as artists." Catlett's time here was formative. So you can go to the next one. Okay, so those were all false starts. Those were all places we could have started, but here's actually where I actually want to begin, if you can believe it. Actually, if you can go back to the one before. Oh, no. Okay, that's fine. So I want to set the scene, and I was going to play you a piece of music. Here's a real quiz for you Yale students. All right, how many of you can hear in your head Shostakovich's 7th Symphony? Can you sing it? No, okay. All right, so I don't have the rights to it. They said because this was being filmed, I can't play it for you. I'm also not gonna hum it. It is a symphony, but you can look it up. So I want you to imagine that we're listening to this very dramatic, very evocative symphony, okay? And it's gonna set the scene. Catlett describes it this way. About 350 of us were squeezed into a small room, sweating on a hot June night, with the windows closed and the shades drawn. And this was because it was World War II. There were blackouts in New York City. It was very uncomfortable, and we were listening to Shostakovich's 7th Symphony. Very dramatic, okay. Dmitri Shostakovich's symphony, titled Leningrad, was written during the devastating Nazi siege of his hometown in 1941. The symphony had been smuggled out of Russia by a US agent on microfilm in 1942. It was then flown to Tehran, driven through the Middle East and into Cairo, flown to Brazil, and then to DC, where the agent almost forgot it on a lunch tray, but recovered it just before the waiter threw it into the trash. Drama. Okay. After the music was transcribed and performed by musicians in New York, it was broadcast across the country, offering people in the United States an intimate vision of the brutal Nazi assault. In that siege, over 1 million people were cut off from food, heat, or contact with the outside world. Many of the musicians who had originally performed it in Russia regularly fainted from hunger, and some of them even died during rehearsal. The symphony was said to be so powerful that when it was broadcast over loudspeakers in Leningrad, even Nazi soldiers took heart. Years later, one Nazi remarked on the, quote, slow but powerful effect the symphony had. He said, "We began to see that there was something stronger than starvation, fear, and death, the will to stay human." According to M.T. Anderson, the song marked a decisive turn in the siege and in the war, and its power was not lost on US audiences. So this is what Catlett and others had packed into a room in Harlem to listen to on a hot June night. As Catlett recalled, quote, "A professor from Juilliard's music school had come to play his record for our students, who were mostly Harlem's people, janitors, day workers, laundresses, cooks, elevator operators, and so on, the poor black people who served others. In the middle of the 80-minute symphony, the professor stopped the record." Said Catlett, "When the first movement ended, the professor explained that since the second movement was very long, we could all take a break and refresh ourselves with some cold hummus with cold punch. And our students politely refused. They said, no, the break can wait. We want to hear it all together. Now, ignorant me, I had thought they weren't interested in classical music, unquote. So I bring this up because Catlett tells this anecdote in many, many interviews to illustrate what she described in 1996 as her new awareness of a quote, tremendous hunger for culture. The students' hunger, she said in a 2002 New York Times interview, made me realize that artists should create art for everyone, not just an elite. The students she encountered in Harlem were the, quote, domestic workers, people that worked in the dress trades, people that served other people. Their interest and their desire to learn about literature and art and economics and history and so forth was great. That is the big experience in my life. She told this to Kersha James in 1994. The main method of denial, she explained in 1999, was then and continues to be the fostering of an elitist culture which further widens class distinctions, unquote. Her experiences in Harlem, she said in 1998, made her realize that I had to work for people. Up until then, I guess I didn't have any artist philosophy about what I was doing and why. So I want to turn now to think about her time teaching in Harlem at the George Washington Carver School where she had these revelations. And I think you can go to the next one. So when we think about popular education, we often think about the advances made by people like Paulo Freire with Pedagogy of the Oppressed, or perhaps the freedom schools created during the civil rights movement in the 1960s. But as historians like Marvin Gettleman and education scholar Jonathan Hunt have argued, these common narratives of popular education obscure the foundational work done from the 1920s onward. Between 1923 and 1957, possibly the largest system of adult education in America, according to Gettleman, was the network of adult schools organized by labor unions and the Communist Party. These were, quote, the functional equivalent of a university for the working class who could both learn a vocation and also enter the, quote, world of ideas, even if they were kept out of formal elite institutions of higher education. In the cultural front, Michael Denning quotes a Croatian immigrant named Stefan Jarosz, whose name I'm probably mangling, so apologies if anybody knows the pronunciation better. So Jarosz, as he described himself, was foreign-born and poorly educated like many of the students who passed through these schools. Says Jarosz, quote, the radical movement was our teacher. It was a great step to be drawn together in a group, to talk and listen, to be induced to read and study. Where else could we get that opportunity? During World War II, this network of schools vastly expanded. In the Popular Front area, which emphasized national unity against fascism, schools drew on national patriotic culture. Boston's school was called the Samuel Adams School. Chicago's was named after Abraham Lincoln, and Philadelphia's for Tom Paine. In New York, as Denise Lynn has recently described, the main school was the Thomas Jefferson School, or the Jeff School, and you're looking at a broadside from it, which was located at 575 6th Avenue. In the Jeff School's first publication, it used pretty unapologetic language to describe its classes and forums, terming them, quote, mass weapons as sharp and decisive as bullets in the struggle against fascism. Okay, so in 1944, you can say, in 1944, Catlett joined the staff of the George Washington Carver School, which was also known as a People's Institute at 57 West 125th Street in Harlem between 7th and 8th Avenue. So if other schools were named after so-called American heroes, Harlem's was named after George Washington Carver, a black agronomist and botanist who made extraordinary advances in soil cultivation after Reconstruction. While his name is often associated, I think insultingly associated with what? Peanut butter. He should be credited with brilliantly developing farming methods to enliven the fallow earth. His methods introduced new crops with high protein content that not only nourished communities, but also replenished the soil that had been stripped and depleted by excessive, brutal cotton cultivation. His findings allowed new worlds to grow out of brutal grounds. So I think it's a beautiful name for a school. The Carver School was a product of the NNC and drew heavily from the ranks of organized workers. I think you can go to the next one. The Longshoremen, the Marine Cooks and Stewards Union, which historian Alan Barrowbay describes as having their own radical anti-racist, anti-sexist, and anti-homophobic politics in the 1930s and 40s. Their slogan, according to Barrowbay, was no red baiting, no race baiting, and no queen baiting, since members knew that if they could be divided along any of these lines, they could be defeated. The Carver School tied them to the space of Harlem. Board members like Ben Davis, Harlem's communist councilman, was active in supporting radical black left institutions. Others like Du Bois and Paul Robeson were simultaneously part of the Council on African Affairs, an organization that worked in solidarity with African struggles against colonialism and apartheid. William Patterson, depicted here in one of Catlett's later images, was head of the International Labor Defense and was one of many members who also worked with the Civil Rights Congress and the global campaign to free the Scottsboro Boys. So Catlett describes moving between spaces and thinking about Harlem, police violence, the poverty and debt of its residents, and the gendered vulnerabilities they experienced in the context of global anti-fascist and anti-colonial struggle. I think you can go to the next one. It should be said that World War II had the unintended consequence of enhancing women's leadership, particularly in the black left and particularly in Harlem. As Eric Gettleman writes, a younger group of black women took over much of the NNC's operation in New York City. So to tell the story of the Harlem Left is to talk about a world where women like Mary Louise Patterson, Esther Cooper Jackson, Claudia Jones, Marvell Cook, Augusta Savage, Eslanda Robeson, to just name a few, were all in decisive leadership positions. So building on the already excellent studies by historians like Deo Gore, Barbara Ransby, Carol Boyce Davis, Cheryl Higashida, Keith Gilliard, and many, many others, I think that Catlett can be more firmly elevated to the ranks of these leaders, as well as her friend and Carver School director, Gwendolyn Bennett. You can go to the next one. So much of Bennett's story can be found actually, in some of the publications of the day. This is a beautiful profile the Chicago Defender did of her in 1946, but most of it can actually be found in her FBI file, as I discussed in the larger chapter. So with Bennett, as with Margaret Burroughs, there's much to say about how these women's relationships with Catlett were a critical component of their collective radicalization. But let me say a little bit more about Catlett and Harlem. You can go to the next one. So little is written about Catlett's work while she was in New York City. In oral histories, Catlett has described only being a staff illustrator for the NNC newsletter. Yet archives show that Catlett produced much more than illustration, particularly when you look through her various correspondence with Du Bois. In one note, she writes in her capacity as executive secretary of an art initiative in Detroit organized by the NNC and New Masses. She asked Du Bois to serve as co-chair to, quote, combat the campaign of racial antagonism that is being carried on in Detroit by followers, and you can go to the next one, of Gerald L.K. Smith and other American firsters, which another low resolution image, but I was trying to give you a sense of what his followers look like, and also what some of the resonance of their propaganda, was. There's a frightening resonance between some of the American first language being used today. Catlett was trying to organize this effort to use art and to bring in Du Bois to directly confront this American fascist movement. You can go to the next one. Catlett was also a very shrewd writer, as could be seen in an article she wrote for the New Masses. So in 1946, the Brooklyn Museum had an exhibit called The Negro Artist Comes of Age, and you can go to the next one. So Catlett wrote this great scathing review, which includes the decisive line, the title itself is an insult. And she says black artists have contributed to American culture since the late 18th century. Had the museum had the consciousness about style or form, they wouldn't have grouped these artists together with nothing uniting them but the fact that they were black. So she would work in New York in other very public capacities. At one point, she spoke alongside Communist Party leader William Z. Foster at a conference called Art as a Weapon, and she received a lot of criticism for this appearance. But as she joked in a later interview, so there I was, working in a red front school and speaking on a program with William C. Foster. Also, I worked with the Committee for the National Negro Congress. That made me a communist 3 times. But once you know, Dr. Du Bois said, if you take one step backwards, you never stop running. So I decided not to take that one step back. I think you can go to the next one. In the ferment of Harlem in the 1940s, whereas Harold Cruz described, quote, nobody gave a damn who you were or what your politics were, debates raged between communists, black nationalists, anti-communists, and liberals at places like the YMCA. Cruz, who was, of course, later a fierce anti-communist, said at the time, quote, anybody that couldn't argue Marx or Engels was considered a goddamn dummy, unquote. Cruz took his first class with Du Bois at the Carver School. He also took a class on philosophy by Howard Selsom, who was a former professor at Brooklyn College for 10 years. Selsom had been dismissed by the local New York Rap Corday investigation, which purged suspected leftists from their teaching jobs. Many teachers at Carver were victims of this early Red Scare hysteria, an unfounded assault on public education, as Ellen Schrecker has powerfully documented. Usually it was students who were much more radical on campus than their teachers. Students often only learned that their teachers had been on the left after hearing that they had been killed, for example, in the Spanish Civil War. As one substitute teacher in Harlem described, if you were drawn to the people who worked hardest to change things for students, you inevitably found yourself with communists. They were the ones who looked out for their coworkers, who fought against the exploitation and repression faced by students, staff, or local neighbors. Mark Starr, whose papers are at the Tamament, and who was avowedly not a communist, but he was head of worker education for the ILGWU, he formed a committee at this time to combat Red Scare attacks on education. And this is what he says in one of those documents, quote, talk of subversive and immoral activities is nothing but a smokescreen behind which the enemies of public education seek to destroy the economic and intellectual foundations of our school system. I think this is an important critique to resurrect. So while many talented teachers lost their jobs in the Red Scare, places like the Carver School gained the benefit of their labor. Initially, Carver students cut a wide swath across Harlem's social classes, but after an article by Westbrook Pegler denounced the school as a red front, most of the middle-class students left. As a result, the students of Carver were the cooks, maids, janitors, elevator operators, garment industry workers, and domestic workers of New York who took courses for $3 each. And the students quickly transformed the place as their own. Young artists painted the original dreary walls of the school. A volunteering minister rolled up his sleeves and glued together chairs for the students to sit on. McCrory's Five and Dime donated a grand piano. In the first term, 157 people came from trade unions, fraternal organizations, youth groups, and churches. After 3 years, enrollment rose to 702 students. And in a 1946 Chicago Defender article, one student, Catherine Hennant, describes her experience. Quote, I wondered why I was receiving such valuable and capable guidance at so small a fee. What a profound thing to say. How is this possible? I thought about my teacher and why he must have been interested in the problems of the working class, since he used politics to illustrate the meaning and use of words. I then began to wonder about other teachers, whether they too were interested in the problems of workers. I decided that the Carver School must be a school for the fair-thinking people of this community. Why? Because black and white were serving side by side to aid those of us who sought a better understanding of life and problems. The curriculum was based according to what students needed. Popular classes included a Black History class taught by Elaine Locke and E. Franklin Frazier. Erwin Freundlich of Juilliard taught music appreciation. Dorothy Homer, who was the head librarian at the 135th Street Public Library, held a class on current book and social classes. The head of price control taught a course called Your Dollar and How to Spend It, and the students jokingly suggested that they would rather have a class called Your Dollar and How to Get It. Classrooms offered students the opportunities to discuss politics as they unfolded in Harlem. As Catlett recounted, some cops shot a soldier in the back in a hotel when LaGuardia was mayor, and the people cleaned out of 125th Street and everything. Yeah, well, we analyzed that in our school, why that happened. The most popular class at the Carver School, as a Chicago Defender described, was one called How to Make a Dress. Catlett taught this popular class, and she recalled common conversations that she would have about it when people would ask, quote, how do you teach Marxism making a dress? And I said, while we're sewing, we talk. And when a lady says, I have to leave early to get my news, I say, do you know what the news thinks of you and of black people? And we get into a discussion of why newspapers are printed and who reads them and what they support and what they don't support. And that was the way it worked. In these classes, Catlett would come into the closest contact with black domestic workers in Harlem. The question of black domestic workers had occupied the organizing efforts and theorization of black radical feminists in Harlem. I think you can go to the next one. Writers like Alice Childress would go on to devote much of her Freedom Ways column, Conversations from Life, to the lives of black domestic workers. Marxist Claudia Jones would devote a 4-page section to her famous 1949 essay, An End to the Neglect of the Problems of the Negro Woman, to the domestic worker. Marvell Cook would write a series of articles about their struggles. In 1935, Cook and another young organizer, Ella Baker, co-authored the famous article Bronx Slave Market, describing the humiliations of black domestic workers huddled on street corners in the early morning hours, awaiting inspection from middle-class white women for potential labor for the day. And Baker and Cook emphasized the role of clothing as critically enabling or preventing employment. The dress marked ability, social class, levels of desperation, and it signaled the form of labor the wearer was willing to undertake. Quote, rain or shine, cold or hot, you will find them there, women old and young, sometimes bedraggled, sometimes neatly dressed, waiting expectantly. And go to the next one. So for black domestic workers, dresses were not just objects of fancy, but necessary for confronting the complexities of their employment. Catlett's material engagement helped elaborate the multiple forms of valorization that was happening through the dress. These articles of clothing were class signifiers, prerequisites for entrance into different spaces and places of employment. Their style, color, and upkeep became unstable markers of employability. They needed to be clean to signal reliability, and also stylish enough to make the wearer a conspicuous object of servitude, able to impress the friends and neighbors of the white women who hired them. These were also objects of utility necessary to clothe the body, so they needed to be sturdy, flexible, and durable enough to work in. And as Catlett recounted, it was easier to have navy blue or brown or black that didn't show so much dirt. These were, after all, not just costumes, they were uniforms. And the dresses also had to be understood as potential liquid assets that could be sold in desperate conditions. During one cold winter in Iowa, Catlett had been forced to sell her own coat in order to afford rent and food. So she understood this relationship well. Critically, and you can go to the next one, these dresses also had to subtly convey the wearer's availability or unavailability for sex work. While it was more often wealthy white women who did the hiring, Baker and Cook note that husbands, sons, brothers, under the subterfuge of work, offer worldly-wise girls higher bids for their times. These scenes underscored the ways in which the complex realities of race, gender, and class victimized black domestic workers and forced them into vulnerable entanglements. Accordingly, clothes had to be complex vectors of communication, aware of the racialized, class, and gendered violence that seethed behind every transaction. And I want to say, I had to cut this for time, but I think it's really important to add that as much as we are talking about these dresses that were made for work, there's also great joy in the dresses. Catlett gave an award to a woman who she thought did a fabulous aquamarine dress with a particular style, and I think, like joy, desire, love have to be as critical a part of the analysis, but that was a kind of whole different section. I'm trying to get us out of here before 9 o'clock. So how to make a dress was perhaps one space where the complex politics of black working class women's daily lives could be untangled. Catlett even described learning about how clothing reflected her students' housing conditions, since women, quote, didn't have bathrooms or they shared them with somebody. And this also determined where and how dresses could be washed and mended. So this class was a unique space within which the complex relations that went into the commodity of the dress, the commodity of the labor power of these women, and the understanding of capital, not as an abstraction, but a practice, a determinate set of social relations where the inseparability of racism, patriarchy, and class could be understood. But if the dresses signaled the vulnerability of the wearer, they could also become, as Peter Stallybrass writes, the materialization of class resistance. You can go to the next one. New York City, after all, had low resolution, had the highest rates of unionized black domestic workers, as Esther Cooper Jackson, who would be the future editor of Freedom Ways magazine described in her 1940s master's thesis. And this is an article from the Daily Worker about some of the domestic worker organizing. Such organizing was necessary, as Du Bois would argue in Darkwater, quote, as long as domestic service was the rule for black people, emancipation would always remain a conceptual abstraction. So in these ways, the Carver School gave Catlett the transformative opportunity to better understand the position of black working class women in relation to global struggles for social change. It also helped her understand how art could be responsive to their lives and to political and social movements. And so with this in mind, she proposed a series about the lives of black working class women, and she submitted an application to the Rosenwald Fellowship to go to Mexico. I think you can go to the next one. Okay, you guys all with me? We went to DC, we went to Texas, we went to Durham, North Carolina. We've been all over the world. I have a few things to say about Mexico, and then I'd be really curious. Are we okay on time? Okay, a few things to say about Mexico. So why Mexico? Why go to Mexico? Mexico had been a part of Catlett's consciousness since she began studying art in DC. Actually, her first painting job was to paint a Diego Rivera-style mural, and she was actually fired from the job because she said she spent too much time partying and making dresses. You can go to the next one. So Diego Rivera, perhaps the most famous of the Mexican muralists, wrote in 1932, quote, the importance of the artist can be measured directly by the size of the multitudes whose aspirations and whose life he serves to condense and translate. Black artists in the US, particularly since the 30s, had been moved by this intention. They shared with Mexican revolutionary artists a radical anti-racist ethic, a refusal to promote elite interests or its racist aesthetics. Not only were individual Mexican muralists great influence on mural artists in the US, the very inspiration, I don't know how many of you know this, the very inspiration for the Federal Arts Project of the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, came from Mexico. That national effort effectively reframed artists as cultural workers and subsidized their work in service to the public. And the WPA project changed the property relation of art, putting murals in, quote, public possession, as head of the Federal Arts Project said, making art the property of all rather than the hobby of few. Murals hung in public buildings and became public entities that could not be sold to private buyers. It was not uncommon for black artists to encounter other WPA-funded artists who had been to Mexico and who had worked with Diego Rivera or with the Viraferos Sequeiros or Jose Clemente Orozco, who were called Los Tres Grandes. In turn, Mexican artists came to the US, especially during the reactionary period after the revolution. So for many black American artists, Mexico became a mecca where they were able to develop their radical training. The influence of the Mexican artists was so strong that the head of fine arts in the WPA vowed to stop the radical content. He said he vowed to stop what he called the Mexican invasion on the border. So I'm showing you this image because the influence of Mexican artists was very strong in New York City. I don't know how many of you have been to the New Whitney exhibit, which really makes these kind of cross-fertilizations clear. So, you know, this is a very bad image of Rivera painting the Man at the Crossroads mural in Rockefeller Center, which was destroyed shortly after he completed it. Of course, any of you who have been to New School have probably seen Jose Clemente Orozco's murals around the New School. And there were a number of exhibitions. I think you can go to the next one. Leif Rayford does a really incredible job of describing two competing exhibitions that were organized by the NAACP and the Communist Party, both protesting lynching. Both of them featured Orozco's image, Hangmen, which was a haunting image of 4 black lynchmen who were being consumed by fire. And art historians have subsequently observed that there are a lot of stylistic similarities between the way he's depicting lynching and earlier series he'd done about violence suffered during the Mexican Revolution. This other piece, Death or Lynched Figure, was done by by Japanese-American artist Isamu Noguchi, who had traveled to Mexico. And this work was also displayed in both exhibits. This haunting sculpture was based on a photograph of a contorted body somebody who had been lynched and subsequently set on fire that had been published by the ILD. So the kind of consciousness of Mexican artists in New York, or artists who had gone to Mexico and then come back to participate in struggles against lynching, would have been something that was very much a part of the fabric of the city. So it was in New York that Catlett met members of the Taller de Gráphica Popular who invited her to join them in Mexico. You can go to the next one. So Catlett received a Rosenwald grant to travel to Mexico to complete this series on Black women. And you can go to the next one. So the Taller, or TGP, took commissions from labor organizations, student groups, literacy campaigns. And what was really unique about them was that they produced the symbology being asked of them together. So in joining the TGP, Catlett was not just exposed to this unique collective of artists, and this is a profile of some of the artists from 1956, but she was also exposed to a unique style of pedagogy as well, and you can go to the next one. At the end of the day, the artists would all gather their work and affix it to the walls. Moving slowly as a group, they would stop at every drawing and discuss. Catlett recounts, at the Taller, we were more or less, we worked collectively. Everyone was interested in your project. Each artist would select a theme, go home, and do a drawing. Then the drawings were brought in and put up so we could see how they related to the assignment. And the criticism was always constructive. Quote, I think the symbolism is very good, someone might say, but the drawing is weak. To make it stronger, you could improve the way you drew that hand, which you slurred when you were focusing on the face. Let me help you. So the success of the image was the, not yet. The success of the image was the shared intention of the collective. The collective asked, could the image convey its message to the other artists present? Could it illustrate the specific elements of the campaign for which striking students, trade unions, or anti-fascist groups had enlisted their help? How might it disrupt prevailing assumptions about power and inequality? Could it, in turn, communicate these visions to the majority of people in Mexico and beyond? Okay, so you have a snapshot of who this group was. Now, Catlett had come to Mexico to produce a print series celebrating the lives of Black working class women, which she later retitled The Black Woman. And when you place all the images together, the titles of the images can be read as a poem. So after every phrase, you're just going to have to advance to the next one. So I am the Black woman. Go ahead. I've always worked hard in America. In the fields, in other folks' homes, I've given the world my songs. In Sojourner Truth, I fought for the rights of women as well as blacks. In Harriet Tubman, I helped hundreds to freedom. In Phyllis Wheatley, I proved intellectual equality in the midst of slavery. My role has been important in the struggle to organize the unorganized. I have studied in ever-increasing numbers. My reward has been bars between me and the rest of the land. I have special reservations, special houses, and a special fear for my loved ones. My right is a future of equality with other Americans. So when Catlett arrived at the TGP, artists were in the middle of producing a series on the history of the Mexican Revolution. You go to the next one. The Estampas de la Revolución Mexicana is a series of 85 lino cuts, and Catlett was clearly moved by what she saw. Go ahead to the next one. And let me just tell you really briefly, like this whole thing I'm presenting to you today is just really my attempt to solve a mystery, which when I went to Stanford to look at this collection and went through it and then found this collection in the same box, I had to make sense of what I was looking at. And when you look at the images side by side, I think a number of stylistic, political, and historical resonance become clear. So you can go to the next one. So for example, in the Tallers, you have prominent images of heroes of the revolution, like Pancho Villa, and in Catlett, you have, similarly positioned black women like Harriet Tubman. You can go to the next one. Or in others, Zapata and Sojourner Truth. And you go to the next one. Significantly, both series also celebrate the experiences of ordinary men and women, their lives as workers, musicians, grievers, fighters, and organizers. So, you know, a lot of my effort is just to make sense of why these two series are so similar. If you can go to the last one. We don't have time, but it was actually when I saw And a Special Fear for My Loved Ones and realized, I'm not sure how well you can see the gesture of the hands, but you know, feeling a kind of deja vu, like that there was just a lot of stylistic similarity between how these two bodies were positioned, what the kind of location in the foreground and background, what these different stylistic elements were trying to do, that I had to go back and start thinking about these two decisively together. If we had more time, I'd love to talk about the kind of resonance between these two images, you know, given some of our technical difficulties and the late hours of the day, I'm going to just try to wrap up here so you can go to the next one. By way of conclusion, let me just say this. In 1942, there's this great record where Catlett debated the concept of internationalism with her teacher, Osip Zadkin. So Catlett, in addition to going to the Carver School, also took private lessons with this Russian-born sculptor in his Coldwater, Greenwich Village studio. Zadkin, who was Jewish, had come to New York City after fleeing the Nazis in Paris. Like Picasso's famous depictions of fascism in Guernica or Shostakovich's musical composition against fascism, Zadkin's work was also motivated by the fight against fascism. His modernist sculptures took on themes of suffering, the destruction of cities in war, and universal pain. His artwork, he explained, was necessarily internationalist. In this moment of global crisis amidst the rise of fascism, he asked Catlett why she insisted on sculpting images of black women and children, a theme he asserted that was limited and decidedly nationalist. And Catlett would have none of it. In a 2002 interview, she recounted how she pushed Zadkin on his definition of internationalism. Why couldn't people identify with the black mother and child the way they might with his so-called internationalist imagery, she asked. What made him assume that her artwork was limited instead of universally identifiable? And why did he presume that his sculpture of a male poet adorned with a French poem on it wasn't itself nationalist? So to recover the political life of Elizabeth Catlett broadens our conception of internationalism and opens this still urgent question. Around the world, people right now are confronting violent, racist, sexist, settler colonial, nationalist movements. Here in the US, we're seeing a frightening rise of white supremacist nationalism. So at this moment, I think it's imperative that we recover the submerged history of Catlett's internationalism, a tradition essential for our survival. Thank you.
Field questions.
Sure.
And we'll do about 10 minutes of questions and then have time afterwards if you want to talk.
Sure. It's a lot of pressure to ask the first question, but something that I noticed throughout all of your work, including the very beginning of your talk, is the idea of surveillance, and I think that came up with your piece about broken windows policing, and also just the great attention the FBI has on Catlett's life, especially living in Mexico. And I just wanted to know, oh Lord, I just wanted to know how this, what is the thing I'm trying to, sorry.
I'm so excited by your question right now.
I'm really fascinated with this idea that surveillance comes from sort of the dominance idea of power that is held within the people that they're trying to control.
Yes.
And I just wanted to hear you speak more about that.
Oh God, what an invitation. I'll keep you guys here for 2 more hours. What a beautiful question. I don't know how many of you are in the class that read the piece I wrote that begins with the Haitian Revolution. But you know, I wrote this piece that starts off with the first instance of the use of aerial surveillance in the Americas, and it was during the Haitian Revolution. And there's this amazing story of this hot air balloon that took off from this plantation that later was the plantation where, you know, the first uprisings of the Haitian Revolution began. So, you know, I wrote that, and as soon as I wrote it, I was like, I think all my work is about surveillance, you know, in a way that maybe I haven't even fully digested. So once you said the word, I was like, are you a plant? You know, did you materialize from my subconscious? Because it's a question I'm trying to figure out. And what I conclude, or you know, how I introduce that piece is, you know, I tried to contrast the vision, the way of seeing, the illusion of omniscience, right, of the French colonial powers, right? This idea that they were all-knowing, all-seeing, that, you know, by the technology of the hot air balloon, they could not only conquer land, they can conquer air. And so what an extraordinary rebuttal to have, like, you know, the arrogance of that rebuffed with the Haitian Revolution breaking out right where that was launched. And so what I conclude by saying is that, you know, we can't think of surveillance as a position of dominance, but the anxiety of a regime aware of its own illegitimacy. And I think retooling surveillance is really helpful for understanding a consistent dialectic in terms of, you know, struggle.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That have been really important parts of a radical pedagogy, really important parts of a sociality. And I just wonder what you're thinking in terms of the importance of art. Or how do you know, it's that's what I've been talking about for this last hour, but in a way it's kind of like a latent argument.
Yes. Well, I'm not an art historian, you know, I just play one on TV, YouTube. So, you know, I mean, it's one of the things that I am really, you know, I mean, it's like the story of looking at those two series at Stanford and then just kind of having an intuition that there was something similar there, right? And then having to read from a lot of very smart art historians who could sort of explain, this is what those styles meant. You know, I think the mode of production of art at this time itself, I think, is something I'm really fascinated by, right? You know, Catlett is a sculptor. She adores sculpture. You know, this is what she trained in at the University of Iowa, but because of her experiences at the Southside Community Arts Center in Chicago, because of her experience with the Washington Carver School, and because of her experiences in Mexico, she, you know, has this transition where she says, now look, you know, sculpture is beautiful and powerful, but you can't pass a sculpture around. Now a lithograph or a linocut, you know, those are prints, prints that allow you to replicate an image very quickly, very cheaply, so that a lot of people can have them. So, you know, I mean, there's a kind of interesting, I don't know, you know, I mean, if I was smarter, I'd probably have the introduction and dialogue with Benjamin's, you know, work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction, to just, because I think the question of reproduction and making art that could be easily reproduced, you know, like, so thinking about gestures that could tell a lot rather than highly detailed things that were harder to carve into a linocut. You know, I think there's a lot of translating work that she's having to do when she starts thinking that the reproduction of these images are so critical to the politics itself. But like I said, I'm kind of a poser in these things. I'm learning. Thanks for the question. Yes?
One of the first pieces that we've read for class tomorrow, you described blues epistemology as a philosophical system of explanation developed by the Black class and excavated through soft poetry, art, and culture. And I'm wondering if you could just speak more to whether or not you see blues epistemology as kind of tracing a through line through internationalism, or if you see those two modes of thinking and the practices that surround those two, like the practices that surround those two epistemologies as intertwined in some way, or if you're reading them relationally. I'm just curious about how you
So I'm going to have to get both your names at the end so I can properly credit you for helping consolidate a lot of the ideas in my book, because I don't think either one were necessarily apparent to me. I mean, in that essay that you read, I'm drawing on Clyde Woods' work, and he explains blues epistemology in his classic book, Development Arrested. And it was a question that he asked us to think really hard about. Dan showed the images of some of the readers that I was involved with. The first one was about militarized policing in Skid Row, Los Angeles. And Clyde, from his deathbed, said, you have to talk about housing, and you have to think about the blues epistemology there. So, whether acknowledged or unacknowledged, it's definitely this subconscious that I think I'm thinking about in all my work. And I wouldn't have, until you said it, really thought about how blues epistemology does help crystallize a lot of the insights I'm trying to make about Catlett and the revolutionary milieu she was a part of. With full respect, I think I have to step back and think about your comment and how I'm putting those two things together, because I think it's probably been more subconscious than it's been overt. But that's, for clarification purposes, it probably should be overt. So Benjamin, Clyde Woods, you guys are writing the intro. I really appreciate it. Yes. Which one did you read?
Stephanie Smith.
Yes.
And something that I remember about the TPP is that it was meant to make art for the people, for the public, but also to stir within the public. So I wonder what was her attempt at thinking of the Mexican public and the impact their art could have. Because there's obviously an audience in the U.S., but
yes.
what was the purpose?
Well, I don't have, Okay, we can try. I have some extra slides at the end. You can just go forward, which I hope is here. So some of these are actually images that the Taller did in the years after Catlett came, which are, I had to find these in a lot of archives and go, how come nobody has just told the story? You can keep going. Of how it was, what was the consciousness of this Mexican, Mexico City Internationalist Art Collective thinking about all these different figures. Sorry, you can go to the next one. For example, this is, actually, can you go to the next one? So this is not a piece by Catlett, but I am 78% sure that that's her. She had these characteristic glasses. And you can go to the next one. So you can go to the next one. Maybe I don't have it here. I thought I had some slides of Catlett's actually contribution to the images of the Mexican Revolution, because it's actually, here's maybe the conclusion of this chapter. So, each of these 85 prints tell a different, phase in the story of the Mexican Revolution. She does one of the later ones under Cardenas, right? And so it's all of these Mexican people supporting the effort to nationalize oil in the country, right? And so there's a number of farmers who are bringing chickens. There's some people bringing a few coins. But what she has in the foreground of this image are women with sewing machines, right? All putting them on the table as their contribution. So I was excited to show you that picture just to show you that there are different ways that she was, she's really thinking in a broad way. What does internationalism mean? What does it mean with the connections I have in the United States? What does it mean to throw in with these revolutionaries who are based in Mexico City but are trying to also speak to the world? And I think that she's got a particular attendance to what the local history and struggles look like. Thank you, yes. So that's a partial answer to your question. It's a big question, and she lives in Mexico for 65 years, so this is at the heart of her art production and her teaching and her politics.
I just want to say, we talk in our class about the distinction between relational versus comparative formations, and how relationality is about co-production, co-constitution, and making. And that was just, I've never seen a presentation that so captured relationality as something active that we engage in and make anew. I'm so grateful for this presentation. Join me in thanking.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all.